Throughout history, there have been people born differently that have been considered less than normal, and I would like to touch on one of those groups today, which would be the deaf community. The deaf community is a group of people that have faced their fair share of hardships, with people assuming they are not capable of completing tasks as well as a hearing person would normally. In 1540, Pedro Ponce de Leon, a Spanish monk, is credited with being the first person to teach the deaf. This is amazing because despite stereotypes that deaf individuals are less able to learn and were harder to teach because they did not have their own language available to express themselves, he worked to help them provide them with one. In the 17th through the 19th century, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, residents had created their own version of sign language because about 1 out of every 155 residents experienced a hereditary form of deafness which presented as complete deafness from birth. The hearing and the deaf would both use this language. As the numbers of deaf individuals on the island decreased, the island sign language died out in 1952. In the 18th century, in Paris, France, Charles Michel Delahaye founded the first school for deaf children, and it focused on the use of sign language as well as the national spoken and written language as part of their education. In 1778, Samuel Haneke established a school for the deaf in Leipzig, Germany, that centered on the oral method of education. It focused on training deaf children in lip reading and the articulation of oral speech in their national language, instead of teaching them sign language to blend them into society. In 1873, Laurent Clerc, a deaf teacher, along with Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, an American education philanthropist, founded the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. Clerc's experience with French Sign Language, or LSF, greatly influenced American Sign Language, otherwise known as ASL. In April 1864, there was a college opened up for the deaf and hard of hearing by President Abraham Lincoln, named the National College for the Deaf and Dumb. That name lasted through 1865. The next name it was given was the National Deaf Mute College. They held that name through 1860. They held that name from 1865 through 1894. In 1880, the U.S. National Association of the Deaf was founded. The association focused on ensuring sign language is a staple of education for deaf individuals and that the rights of deaf people were respected in everyday life. However, in the following years, they would still face persecution for something that was entirely out of their control. In the late 1800s through the 1920s, the social shift and the suppression of American Sign Language became more normalized. The oralist method became dominant and sign language was suppressed in an attempt to take the language away from the deaf community to normalize deaf people while also taking away their culture. In 1883, Alexander Graham Bell, famous for inventing the telephone, called for the prevention of the marriage of deaf people as it posed a threat to a deaf-mute variety of the human race, even though there are no differences between the deaf or hard of hearing community and the hearing community except for the ability to be able to hear. The National Deaf Mute College changed its name yet again to Gallaudet College in 1894, and they kept that name until 1986, then changed the name to Gallaudet University, and that is the current name that they hold. March 13th, 1988, Gallaudet University appoints its first deaf president after the students led a protest demanding a deaf president now. Throughout their history, they have been labeled as deaf and dumb, which is the furthest from the truth. Most learn to lip read because they need it to survive. Others keep pens and paper on board to have the ability to communicate with people. Although they have a very oppressive history, they use every moment they have in life to the fullest to support their community. When a deaf family has hearing children, they're considered CODAs, otherwise known as Children of Deaf Americans. People often wonder how deaf parents would take care of a hearing child, and for this I can only speak from my own experience. It's no different than being around hearing family members, except they can't control their volume when yelling at a football game or if they spill something. They're not any more or less normal, and they always do their best. I'm forever grateful for the experience of having deaf parents. Some people think you should learn sign language, and I agree it's hard to get people on board because a lot of CODAs don't know sign language. They just know enough to get by. As sad as it is, some parents rely on technology and pen and paper to communicate with their children. My parents made sure that my siblings and I were fluent in sign language, and I am grateful for that because I can communicate with them, other family members, and the deaf community. Their culture is rich in love, bright colors, and wild textures, as their experience is mainly visual and physical. I have met all sorts of people in the deaf community, and they're just like anyone else. Life as a CODA has had a special place, or has let a special peek into their culture, and nobody bats an eye when you talk with them with your mouth full as long as you put down your knife.